Here's something that might sound familiar. You sit down to write, maybe it's a scene you've been excited about, maybe it's the opening chapter, maybe it's a section you've been building toward for weeks. You open the document and within minutes, sometimes even seconds, a voice in your head pipes up and it says things like, "This isn't good enough. This idea doesn't make sense. No one's going to want to read this. Why are you even bothering?" And just like that, the idea that felt alive 5 minutes ago starts to shrink. The energy drains out of it and you start second guessing, rewriting, or perhaps even deleting it. Then you close the document entirely. What if I told you that one of the most creative and commercially successful minds of the 20th century had the exact same problem, and he built a system specifically to solve it? A system that kept his most imaginative ideas safe from his own inner critic long enough to actually bring them to life. Today, my friends, we are starting a 2-part series on the Walt Disney Strategy, an NLP-based creative process that separates dreaming, planning, and refining into 3 distinct and equally important modes. In this first episode, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the strategy is, how each of the 3 modes work, and the practical tools and strategies that you can use to harness each one. Then in part 2, I'm going to guide you through 3 visualizations, 1 for each mode, so that you can experience what it actually feels like to step into each of them. So stay with me. This is one of those frameworks that once you understand it, you'll see your whole creative process differently. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Maddison, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Maddison, and today we're kicking off a 2-part series on something I find genuinely fascinating. But before we dive into today's episode, I want to share with you all a little update that I am honestly so excited about. Write the Darn Book is expanding. And it's expanding in a way that feels so deeply aligned with where this podcast is heading, and more importantly, with what I know is going to support you even more as a writer. When I first began this podcast, I knew I wanted this to be a space where we talked about the inner side of writing, the writer's block, the procrastination, the self-doubt, the perfectionism, the fear, the identity pieces, all of those deeper patterns that can quietly pull us away from the page. And that will absolutely remain at the heart of this show, because I still believe with everything in me that most writers aren't stuck because they lack discipline. They're stuck because something deeper is happening beneath the surface. But writing a book also asks us to work with the book itself, the structure, the characters, the dialogue, the pacing, the revision process, the synopsis, the query letter, the whole publishing journey. So the actual practical pieces that help take your book from an idea in your heart and mind onto the page and out into the world. So moving forward, Write the Darn Book is going to be supporting both sides of that writing journey. On Mondays, we're going to have Mindset Monday episodes where we'll focus on the inner work of writing, so your blocks, your beliefs, your identity, your confidence levels, your creative flow, and how to come back to the page with more trust and steadiness. And on Wednesdays, we'll have Writing Wednesday episodes where we're going to focus on the outer work of writing. So the craft, story structure, character, revisions, publishing insight and the publishing world, querying, synopsis writing, and the practical steps that can actually help you move your book forward. Because finishing a book takes both the mindset and the manuscript, the writer and the work. So it's the inner shift as well as the practical next steps. And I'm really excited about this because my hope is that this gives you even more support, more clarity, and more tools that you can actually use as you write the darn book. So if you're here for the mindset, that is still the heart and core of the show. But if you're also here for the craft and the publishing pieces, they're coming too. And as always, all of it is going to be grounded in the same belief that you are the vessel for your story, and you just have to let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, my friends, let's dive into today's episode. Now, today's episode is the first of a two-part series that is based on a creative strategy with its roots in NLP that was modelled from the way Walt Disney himself worked. And I think this is one of the most practical and immediately usable tools that a writer can have in their creative toolkit. In this first episode, we're covering the full framework, the three models, what each one does, and why each one matters. We're also going to discuss how to actively harness all three in your writing process. Then, in part 2, I'll take you through 3 guided visualizations to help you step into each mode, not just understand it, but to feel it. Let's get into part 1. I want to start with a quote. Disney's co-workers used to say that there were actually 3 different sides when Walt came to work, and they were never quite sure which aspect of Walt was going to walk into the meeting that day. Would it be Walt the dreamer, the expansive, imaginative, full of wild possibilities person? Was it the realist? That was the grounded, practical, focused on what it would actually take to bring an idea to life person? Or was it going to be the critic, the rigorous, exacting, scanning everything for what could go wrong person? Now, on the surface, that might sound like a man who was a little unpredictable. But what NLP researcher and trainer Robert Dilts identified when he studied Disney in the 1990s was something far more deliberate. Disney wasn't being 3 different people by accident. He was, consciously or not, running 3 distinct thinking modes, and crucially, he was keeping them separate. He didn't let the critic into the room when the dreamer was working. He didn't let the realist shut down an idea before it had fully formed. That separation is the genius of this strategy, and it's also the exact thing most writers are not doing. Most of us try to run all 3 modes all at once. We're dreaming up an idea and simultaneously judging whether it's good enough. We're planning a scene while criticising the scenes that we've already written. We're trying to be open and creative while our inner critic sits at the table uninvited, commenting on everything. No wonder it feels exhausting, and no wonder the ideas stop coming. Dilts modelled this strategy and published it in 1994 in his book Strategies of Genius. And it's been used in NLP coaching, business creativity, and problem-solving events ever since. Today, I want to bring it squarely into the writing space because I genuinely believe that understanding and using these 3 modes intentionally is one of the most transformative things a writer can do for their creative process. And before we go any further, I want to name the pattern that I see most often in writers because it's the one that the Disney strategy addresses the most directly. A writer has an idea. It's vivid, exciting, full of life. The dreaming phase has done its work. And then instead of moving into the next phase, the plotting, the planning, the building of an actual structure for the book, they skip straight to the critic. The idea hasn't even been plotted yet. It hasn't been outlined or given a single written page, and already the inner critic is asking whether it's good enough, whether it's original enough, whether anyone will actually want to read it. The realist never even got a chance to turn the dream into something real. So the critic ends up judging a concept, not a book. And concepts without the work of the realist behind them rarely survive that kind of scrutiny. And that is how books die before they're even written. Not because the idea wasn't good enough, but because the wrong mode was running at the wrong time. I want to share a story with you about a writer I worked with, and she came to me stuck. She had a book idea she'd been carrying around for years, genuinely compelling and the kind of story that she truly felt called to write. But every time she sat down to work on it, she'd write a page or two and then stop. And she'd read back what she'd written, decide it wasn't good enough, delete it and start again. Or she'd make notes on the concept, feel a surge of excitement, and then within a day or two, that excitement would collapse into doubt. She'd find herself thinking, who am I to write this? What if it's not as good as I imagined? What if I get it wrong? And when I started working with her, she described her writing sessions as feeling like she was trying to build something while someone kept knocking it down. And when we looked more carefully at what was actually happening, that's exactly what was going on. She was collapsing all three modes together. The moment an idea surfaced, the critic was right there to evaluate it. The dreamer would generate something exciting, and instead of the realist stepping in to say, right, let's plot this out, let's work out how this actually becomes a book, the critic arrived instead. The realist phase was being skipped entirely. The idea never got a plan, it never got an outline, it never got legs. What shifted things for my client wasn't more discipline or more motivation. It was learning to recognize which mode she was in and whether it was the right one for what she was trying to do. And when she started protecting her dreamer phase, genuinely protecting it, not judging it, not evaluating, just generating ideas, and then she deliberately moved into the realist mode to do a loose outline and a plot before she wrote a single scene, everything changed. The critic, when it finally arrived, had something solid to engage in. And because of that, its observations were actually useful rather than devastating. And that's what this strategy does. It doesn't make writing easier by removing the hard parts. It just makes it more sustainable by giving each part of the creative process the right environment to do its job. So let's get into the strategy itself. The Walt Disney Strategy identifies three distinct creative modes: the dreamer, the realist, and the critic. And the first thing I want you to understand is that each of these three modes is equally important. There's no hierarchy here. The dreamer isn't more valuable than the critic, and the critic is not the enemy of creativity. All three are essential, and the power of the strategy comes from running them in sequence rather than running them simultaneously. Now, the dreamer is the first mode, and it's the one that needs to go first always, because the dreamer's job is to imagine without restriction. No limits, no judgment, no asking whether something is practical or achievable or commercially viable. In the dreamer phase, everything is possible and everything is worth exploring. For Disney, the dreamer phase was where his wildest, most imaginative ideas lived. His team would generate concepts that seemed impossible, sometimes even absurd. And that was the point. You can't discover what's truly possible if you're only allowing yourself to think within the bounds of what is already proven. For a writer, the dreamer is the voice that says, what if this character did something unexpected? What if this story went somewhere I haven't planned? What if the scene I've been thinking about could be bigger, bolder, stranger, more emotionally raw than I've ever allowed myself to imagine? The dreamer is where your story concept lives. The idea, the characters, the world, the emotional premise. The what if I started everything? It's the phase before a single page exists. Before you've worked out the plot, before you know how it ends, the dreamer doesn't need to know any of that yet. The dreamer just needs to let the vision be as big and as fully imagined as it wants to be. Because without a genuinely alive dreamer phase, the realist has nothing rich enough to work with. So how do you actually harness the dreamer mode? How do you give your creative mind the conditions it needs to work freely? Well, the first thing is to make it deliberate and protected. Set aside time that is specifically for dreamer work and agree with yourself before you begin that nothing you generate in this time is going to be judged. Not by you, not yet. And you can use a separate notebook or a document, something that feels distinct from your manuscript, and write in it with explicit understanding that none of it needs to be good, it just needs to exist. Ask yourself big, open questions and write whatever comes. What is this story really about at its heart? What does the character want more than anything? What would happen if I took this scene somewhere completely unexpected? What if the story went in a direction that I haven't even considered yet? Let the answers come without filtering them. Write fast, write messy, follow the threads that feel alive even if you're not sure where they lead. You can also use visualization in the dreamer phase, closing your eyes and simply watching your story world as though it's actually a film playing in your mind. You can notice what your characters are doing and what they're saying before you've even asked them to be good enough for the page. The key principle across all of this is that the dreamer mode requires you to temporarily suspend your standards. So not permanently, just long enough for your imagination to show to you what it's actually capable of when it isn't being interrupted. So give it free rein, enjoy it, embrace it, fall into that creative flow of imagination. Now, the realist is the second mode, and it's the mode that takes everything the dreamer has generated and asks, how do we actually build this into a book? And this is where the real creative work of writing actually begins. It's not in the dreaming, as romantic as that sounds, but it's here in the realist phase, because the realist is responsible for turning imagination into reality. And for a writer, that means two distinct and equally important things. First, the plotting and planning, and then the drafting itself. Now, the first draft is a realist document. It's the act of making the dream real, word by word, page by page, scene by scene. And none of that is possible without the realist showing up and actually putting the dreaming phase into action. Now, for Disney's team, the realist phase involved storyboarding. So taking those wild ideas from the dreamer phase and mapping out how they would actually unfold, beat by beat, scene by scene. That's a filmmaking word, storyboarding. But for writers, the equivalent is plotting or outlining. Now, that doesn't mean you have to, because depending on your personality type, you might naturally gravitate to a very loose plot or outline, or you might gravitate to the complete opposite where it has to be all plotted out. And that's fine. Work with whatever is within your wheelhouse of how you are wired. But it's basically that realist phase is when you sit down with the story that your dreamer created and generated, and you work out, okay, what actually happens? In what order? What does each scene need to accomplish? How do the characters move in the story, what their arc is, how they progress and grow? Where do the subplots converge? The realist asks questions like, what needs to happen first? What is the sequence of events that makes this story work? And what does the reader need to understand before this moment can land? And once that work is done, once there's enough of a plan to write toward, the realist picks up the pen or fingers on the keyboard and begins the first draft. The drafting is realist work. It's the sustained, practical, disciplined act of turning everything the dreamer imagined into actual pages. Because remember, without pages, our book doesn't get written. So we need to get pages down. We need to get words down to get the book written. For a writer, the realist is the part of you that plots, plans, structures, and then drafts the first draft. And I want to use that word deliberately, plotting. And I know some of you recoil from hearing that, particularly if you're someone who does prefer to write by instinct or who finds outlining stifling. You might have a complicated relationship with plotting as a concept. But here's the thing. Every writer plots, even pantsers, writers who draft without a formal outline. They are actually plotting when they're sitting down and deciding what happens next in the moment of the story. So when they work out how one scene connects to the one that follows, when they figure out what their character needs to do in order for the story to move, plotting is simply the act of thinking through how the story unfolds. And it doesn't have to be in a detailed chapter by chapter breakdown. It can be as simple as knowing what the next scene needs to accomplish and why it matters. That is realist work, and that is plotting. And once the plotting has given the story enough shape to write towards, the realist keeps going into the drafting itself. So turning that plot and ideas into actual words, turning the plan into pages. And this is where the book actually becomes real. So how do you harness the realist mode, particularly if plotting and outlining don't come naturally to you? Well, the first thing is to lower the bar for what plotting needs to look like. If the word outline makes you feel trapped, don't call it that. Call it a map or a list of questions or a loose sequence of events. The point of realist work is not to produce a perfect plan. It's to give yourself enough of a structure or a roadmap to write towards. Even knowing just the next scene or the next couple of scenes is enough. Even just writing down what your character wants in this chapter or what's stopping them from getting it and what changes by the end, that is realist work, and that's plotting. So for writers who resist structure, the most useful realist question is often the simplest one. What happens next and why does it matter? Ask that question before every writing session and answer it in 2 or 3 sentences before you open your manuscript. That's your realist doing its job. For writers who love structure, the realist challenge is different. It's making sure that the plotting serves the story rather than replacing it. A plan that's so detailed that it leaves no room for the story to surprise you has stopped being a realist tool and started being a way of staying in control rather than staying in the story. The realist's job is always to build the bridge, not build a wall. And when the plotting has given you enough shape to begin, you begin. You start drafting that book. One scene at a time, one page at a time, the realist turns the dream into something real. Now that leads us to our third mode, the critic. And it's the mode that for most writers has been operating entirely in the wrong place. The critic is essential, absolutely essential to the creative process. Without the critic, nothing ever gets refined or strengthened or made ready for the reader and publication. So the critic is a part of you, though, that asks the hard questions and that looks for what isn't working. The critic identifies the gap between what the writing is doing and what it needs to do. But, and this is everything, the critic belongs third. Not first, not second, third. The critic's job is to examine and improve what the dreamer and the realist have already built. When the critic is allowed to run during the dreamer phase, it kills ideas before they're born. And when it runs during the realist phase, it creates paralysis in the plotting and the drafting. The critic can only do its best work when there's something solid to work with and engage with. In Disney's process, the critic phase was where the team stress tested the plan. They asked, what could go wrong? What have we missed? What isn't working and why? And critically, they asked these questions constructively. The critic in the Disney strategy isn't a destructive force. It's a quality assurance mechanism. It's there to make the idea stronger, not to declare it worthless. So for a writer, the critic is your editorial eye. It's the part of you that reads back a chapter and notices where the tension dropped, where a character behaved inconsistently, where a scene isn't earning its place in the book. The critic, used well, makes your writing better. So how do you harness the critic mode well? And how do you make sure it's working for you rather than against you? The first step is the most important one. Wait. The critic earns its place in the process, but it has to be invited in at the right time. As a general rule, the critic belongs after a complete draft of a scene, a chapter, or a section exists, not during it. And then even most of the time, it exists best at the actual end of the first draft, where you've completed that first draft. When you're drafting and you're writing your book and you feel the urge to stop mid-sentence and evaluate what you've just written, that's the critic trying to enter into the realist's space. Notice it, name it, and ask it to wait. Tell it there'll be time later, and then keep writing. When you do invite the critic in, do it deliberately and with a specific brief. So rather than opening a chapter and reading it with a vague sense of dread, give your critic a focused question to answer. Does this scene earn its place in the story? Is this character's motivation clear throughout? Where does the tension drop and why? A critic with a specific job to do is far more useful than a critic let loose on a manuscript with nothing but anxiety to guide it. You can also use the critic's natural precision by reading your work aloud, hearing the rhythm, the pace, the dialogue, because the critic notices problems through the ear that the eye might miss on the page. And perhaps more importantly, train yourself to hear the critic's observations as questions rather than verdicts. So, not this is bad, but rather, what does this scene still need? Not this doesn't work, but rather, what could make this stronger? That shift from verdict to question is what transforms the critic from an obstacle into the most useful creative tool that you have. Now, the sequence regarding these modes matters so much. Dreamer first, realist second, critic third, always. This isn't a suggestion, it's the structural logic of the Walt Disney Strategy. And the most common breakdown I see in writers is not actually the critic interrupting the dreamer, although that does happen too, but the most common breakdown is the writer who skips the realist entirely. They have the idea vivid, exciting, full of possibility. The dreamer's done its work, and then instead of moving into the realist phase, so instead of plotting, planning, working out how this book is actually going to be built and starting to write it, they leap straight to the critic. So the idea hasn't even had a word written yet. It hasn't even been outlined and it hasn't been given any plan at all. And already the critic is asking whether it's good enough, whether it's original enough, whether anyone will want to read it. The realist never even got a chance to turn the dream into something real. So the critic is judging a concept, not a book. And a concept without the realist's work behind it will almost never survive that scrutiny. That is how books die before they're written. Not because the idea wasn't good enough, but because the realist was never given the floor. And here's the part that makes this a cycle rather than a straight line. If the critic identifies a problem, the process loops back. So you return to the dreamer to imagine solutions, then you bring those solutions to the realist to plot and plan them, and then you bring them back to the critic after you've written them to actually test them out. So this loop continues until the work is strong. And that's how creative problems get solved, not by pushing through them with willpower, but by cycling through the 3 modes with intention. The practical anchor that I want you to take away from everything we've covered today is this. Whenever you sit down to write, ask yourself, Which mode am I in right now? And is it the right one for what I'm trying to do? If you're generating, dreaming, brainstorming, exploring, you want to be in dreamer mode, and your inner critic does not have a seat at the table. Whereas if you're in plotting, planning, or you're actually drafting your book, you want to be in the realist mode. If you're revising and refining a draft that already exists, that is when you invite the critic in, deliberately, constructively, and with a specific question to answer. Also with clear permission to leave when that question has been answered. Now in part 2, which will be our next episode, I'm going to guide you through 3 visualizations, one for each mode, so that you can step into the dreamer, the realist, and the critic as felt experiences rather than just ideas in your mind. Because understanding this strategy is one thing. Knowing in your body what it feels like to be fully in each mode, that's what makes it usable at the desk every single time that you sit down to write. The Walt Disney Strategy works because it maps directly onto how your brain naturally moves through the creative process. But here's what I found working with writers. Some of you are wired to spend most of your time in the dreamer phase, but then the critic shuts you down before you even get to the realist. Others get stuck in the realist and can't access the dreamer at all. And the reason that happens is deeply connected to your writing personality and how your brain is wired to create. If you'd love to understand exactly where you tend to get stuck in that cycle and what to do about it, that's exactly what my new Writing Personality Blueprint sessions are for. It's a session that is a focused one-on-one 60-minute Zoom where we look at your writing personality and I put together a personalized blueprint report with strategies tailored specifically to how you create. I have a special introductory price on at the moment for that session. You can find all the details by visiting madisonmichaels.com/blueprint or in the show notes. I've linked to it too. Now, I would love to help you figure out which part of the Disney cycle is yours to work with and how you can make sure you get from one mode to the next as effortlessly as you possibly can. I'd honestly love to support you. That's everything for part 1 today. The dreamer, the realist, the critic, 3 modes, each essential, each with its own job, and each requiring its own protected space to do that. So the strategy isn't complicated, but applying it consistently changes everything about how you show up to your creative work. Part 2 is coming next week, and that is where we bring this to life. 3 visualizations, one for each mode, designed to help you step into each one fully so you know exactly what it feels like when you're in it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Remember, my friends, you are the vessel for your story. Let the words flow through you and onto the page. Take care, and I'll see you in part 2. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.